Psychopolitics of Schizoid Society. What are the signs of a pre-war period? How do the psychopolitical constitutions of capitalist societies before world wars reveal themselves? German history offers an exemplary lesson in how world wars ferment in the psychic, seelish, tensions of a nation. On the basis of two, viewed pessimistically three cases, we can study what it means to live in the prelude to great military explosions. The main psychopolitical symptom is an increasing heaviness in the social atmosphere, which becomes charged with schizoid tensions and ambivalences to the point where it is no longer tolerable. In such a climate, an eerie readiness for catastrophes flourishes. I call it, alluding to Erich Fromm, the catastrophile complex. It attests to a collective disturbance of vitality through which the energies of the living are displaced into a sympathy with the catastrophic, the apocalyptic, and the violently spectacular. The historian knows that political history cannot be the site of human happiness. Nevertheless, if we want to ask when in our century Europeans experienced their happiest hour, we will be embarrassed by the answer. But the signs and documents speak for themselves. We stand at first perplexed before the phenomenon of August 1914. What the peoples of Europe, on entering the war, experienced at that time is designated by historiographers ashamedly as war psychosis. If we look closer, we can see it was a matter of indescribable storms of affect that took hold of the masses, of outbreaks of jubilation and of national emotion, of pleasure and fear and ecstasy of fate. There were moments of pathos and a presentiment of life beyond comparison. The slogan of the times was an ecstatic one. Finally, things have gone so far. The masses probably also experienced fear, but above all a feeling of basic change into something that promised life. The slogans were rejuvenation, putting to the test, cleansing bath, purgative cure. In the first year, the war was waged by purely volunteer armies. No one had to be forced to go to the front. The catastrophe enticed the Wilhelminian youth. When the catastrophe occurred, the people recognized themselves in it and understood that they had waited for it. There is not the slightest reason to believe that the people of that time were so very different from people of today. Only arrogance could allow us to deceive ourselves that we would be smarter in existentially decisive matters than those volunteers from Langemarck, who, by the thousands, pathetically ran into the fire of the machine guns. The only difference is that the psychic mechanisms of later generations operate more subtly. That is why we are initially astounded that the processes then ran so naively and unrestrained on the surface. The war enthusiasts thought they were experiencing the qualitative difference between provisional arrangements and decision, the sultriness and clarification. In a word, the difference between inauthentic and supposedly authentic life. Even after the war, the talk of battle as inner experience wafted through pre-fascist literature. In the war, as it was felt by the men of August 1914, there would finally be something at stake that made living worthwhile. The First World War signals the turning point in modern cynicism. With it, the up-tempo phase of the decomposition of old naiveties begins, such as those about the nature of war, the nature of social order, of progress, of bourgeois values, indeed of bourgeois civilization itself. Since this war, the diffuse schizoid climate around the major European powers has not become any less intense. Since then, those who have spoken of cultural crisis, etc., have had that mental disposition of post-war shock unquestionably in mind that knows that the naivety of yesterday will never exist again. Irrevocably, mistrust, disillusion, doubt, and distanced stances have infiltrated into the socio-psychological hereditary substance. Everything positive will be from then on an in spite of, laced with latent desperation. Since that time, the broken modes of consciousness visibly reign. Irony, cynicism, stoicism, melancholy, sarcasm, nostalgia, voluntarism, resignation to the lesser evil, depression, and anesthesia as a conscious choice of unconsciousness. In the few years of the Weimar Republic, the catastrophile complex built up again until finally the economic crisis ignited the kindling. The joyless republic granted an end to itself. In the myth of revolution, and in the myth of the people, catastrophile tendencies found their respectable underpinnings. Whoever secretly accepted the catastrophe loudly claimed to know where the course of events was heading and which drastic cure was the proper one. Those who saw the catastrophe approaching tried, before it broke, to get the most out of life. In 1931, Erich Kästner captured the voice of a man who was beyond the cliffs of naive morality, and who, with his private lust for life, swam with the current as it flowed towards the next cataract. Serious conversations? How? Is there a life after death? Confidentially, there isn't. Everything must be settled before death. There's a heap of things to do day and night. Better to amuse yourselves than to redeem humanity. As I said, life has to be settled before death. More information gladly given. Don't be so serious, my boy. That is a contemporary voice that in 50 years has become outmoded. This is how a person speaks who knows that he does not change history. In spite of everything, he wants to live before the end, which is disguised as an uprising. Today, the latent will to catastrophe on all sides has taken cover under the official respectability of the politics of peace. The mechanisms whose relatively brutal openness characterised the fascist style have sunk into the subliminal and the atmospheric under the masks of accommodation, goodwill, and sincere sentiment. Naive stimuli have disappeared from the surface of consciousness. The increasing socialization of reactions represses open gestures. What is called necessary in dense what is called democracy means psychologically an increase in self-control, which is probably necessary in dense populations. However, we should not be deceived by the calmed surface. The catastrophile complex lives on, and if not all signs are misleading, its mass is caught up in incessant accumulation. Perhaps it is the accomplishment of terrorism, to speak frivolously, to have made the catastrophile currents, at least here and there, tangible and recognisable. One can refer to what is clearly there. Recall the kidnapping and murder of the president of the Employers Association, Hans Martin Schleyer, the feverish climate of those months when terrorism approached its peak in Germany. At that time, the psychopolitical scenario that belonged to the catastrophile complex again came crassly to light, perhaps for the first time since the Second World War. The media and the voices of state were spontaneously and completely united in their respectable tone of indignation and dismay. Among millions of published sentences, there was hardly a passage in which the truth of the masses in the atmosphere forced its way through. This truth consisted, as every whispered conversation, every scene at a kiosk, dialogues in canteens and bars, chats and lobbies, etc., proved. In a flickering ambivalence of feelings in which existential fears and desire for catastrophe were indistinguishably entwined. The avidness of the reporting, the measureless breadth of the discussion, and the excess of state and private reactions, even viewed in retrospect, speak in unmistakable language. Here something had happened that touched the feeling toward life. A nameless hunger for drama and history, and a desperate longing for conflict on the right front, had so confused hearts and minds that for months on end an event was gnawed away at that in its criminal and political content did not justify such agitation. Through the political staging of the crime and the spectacular interaction of state and terror group, it took on the significance of an epoch-making event. It nourished itself on powerful catastrophile currents and swelled up, becoming the dominant emotional theme of endless days. Socio-psychologically, it brought an hour of truth. It was the substitute for a history in which something moves, the caricature of a liberation struggle, an idiotic criminal parody of that which social democracy under Wilhelm II, Hindenburg and Hitler had neglected. Battle on the wrong front, at the wrong time, by the wrong attackers against the wrong opponents. And yet, in spite of the sum of all these distortions, it was greedily lapped up by society as a substitute for struggle, conflict drug, and political catastrophe film. At one point, the universal consensus in the cynically mute delirium around the event was torn open. I here refer to the paper by Mescalero, who had been naive enough to believe that, without being punished, one could break through conspiracies of silence of this magnitude with honesty and throw open the ambivalences for debate. He thus spoke in a formulation that has become famous, and that is repeated incessantly by the media to millions and millions of ears, of his deep, secret joy. Klamm heimlichen Freude. He discovered in himself in the first moment on hearing of the Buback murder, in order then, in the next moment of reflection, to distance himself from it. Mescalero was shocked at himself and wanted to speak reasonably about his shock. With the Mescalero explosion, the collective ambivalence discharged itself in a grand parade of lies. That was a historical moment of learning. From then on, it could no longer be suppressed that society again lived in a pre-war period, in which all conflicts that had to do with life feelings were decisively postponed to that moment when the external war would make the encounter with inner reality superfluous. In the ballet of rectifications, shieldings, repudiations and protestations, the attitude of respectability celebrated a paper victory over the honesty that had said the other part of the truth, if not for everybody, then at least for many. Since that time we can imagine how the papers will rustle in which, at the outbreak of war, those with responsibility will read of their dismay, shock and resolution. And if there is enough time for this before the atomic burial of the Federal Republic. We can imagine how the papers will rustle in which, at the outbreak of war, those with responsibility will read of their dismay, shock and resolution. If there is enough time for this before the atomic burial of the Federal Republic.